seismic shockwave has ruptured the foundations of the monarchy, breaking through the silent corridors of power in an extraordinary, terrifying revelation. A formal statement from Buckingham Palace has just crossed the wire, signaling an unprecedented, irreversible coup within the ancient bloodline. His Majesty the King has officially initiated the binding legal process to strip his younger son of his birthright, style, and princely title. This was no gentle administrative adjustment, nor a quiet compromise crafted behind polite smiles. It was a surgical, absolute erasure of royal identity, a status carried from birth, extinguished with a single stroke of black ink. Yet behind this public execution of title lies a far darker truth, hidden from the eyes of the world. Within the vaulted, moonlit chambers of the palace, where long shadows stretch across mahogany tables, a master strategist had silently maneuvered every piece. Prince William's unrelenting private pressure had backed his father into an inescapable corner, forcing the monarch to execute a sentence from which there could be no return. Beneath the heavy velvet drapes of his private study, King Charles sat entirely alone with the decree resting before him. The air in the room was suffocating, heavy with centuries of unyielding history. Fixed beneath the final, unforgiving text was Prince Harry's full name, awaiting the executioner's mark. The king did not move for what felt like an eternity. His chest rose in strained, agonizing breaths as his aged fingers tightened around the heavy gold fountain pen. The silence between those stone walls grew heavier than any speech ever delivered from a royal balcony. When a monarch signs a decree, it is an irrevocable act of statecraft that no private tear and no broken heart can ever undo. This parchment stripped his younger son of the princely title he had carried since birth, leaving his blood relationship intact while banishing his authority into darkness. For agonizing months, Charles had endured intense constitutional debates with advisors and the heir to the throne, examining how royal rank without royal responsibility poisoned the crown's authority. Yet no council could make the choice for him. Charles alone carried the crushing weight of the crown, and when the nib finally touched the paper, he acted as king, mercilessly suppressing the weeping father inside him. Thousands of miles away, the strike landed with devastating precision. Harry received the sealed communication late into the night, initially assuming the heavy paper contained routine legal updates regarding security. He broke the thick wax seal, unfolded the document, and as his eyes scanned the opening paragraph, his breath caught in his throat. The words were cold, exact, and absolute. But the true horror awaited his eyes in the supporting records. A confidential file detailing months of secret palace meetings where William's name appeared repeatedly beside pivotal strategic decisions. Harry's jaw locked. His expression hardened into stone. In a hushed, trembling voice, he asked why his brother's name was stamped beside every sentence. The answer had been engineered in locked rooms Harry had never entered. William had approached their father under the banner of institutional survival, framing his brother as an existential threat to the crown. He argued that allowing royal status without royal duty handed a permanent, unguided weapon to someone outside palace control. A handwritten note carried the sharpest blow, a declaration that the monarchy could no longer permit royal status without royal obligation. A phrase written in William's distinct, uncompromising hand. In that terrifying moment, Harry understood that this was far more than a father's weary surrender to protocol. A relentless brother standing closest to the throne had guided the monarch's hand until all resistance collapsed. Long before this document divided them on paper, the two brothers had become strangers bound only by shared blood. William moved as the cold defender of an ancient dynasty, convinced that protecting the throne required total emotional detachment, while Harry stood as the exiled prince who believed the institution had sacrificed his human happiness to preserve itself. Trapped between them was Charles, a father desperate to save his child, yet forced to realize that personal affection could no longer control a constitutional crisis. Outside his father's study, William had stood in silence, repeating the arguments he had prepared. Guilt clawed at him, but an absolute commitment to the crown drove him forward. Every interview and public accusation thrown by Harry had struck William twice. First, as the future sovereign whose legacy was at stake, and second, as a heartbroken brother who remembered when they had once faced the world together. Harry sat beside Meghan in the suffocating quiet of their home, the white pages of the decree laid out before them like a court-martial verdict. His eyes traced the single sentence over and over, pushing the paper away in denial, only to pull it back as if sheer willpower could alter the ink. Losing his military appointments had bled him, Losing his official duties had stung, but losing the title of prince was an amputation of his soul. That single word was not merely a title of nobility, it was his anchor to his childhood, to his service, and to the soft memory of his mother, Princess Diana. It was the last title she had ever whispered to her young boy. Meghan watched in helpless silence as his fury slowly dissolved into a hollow, haunting grief. She gently reminded him that a legal document from a distant palace could alter how courtiers addressed him, but it possessed no power to erase his blood, his memories, or the boy the world had wept for. Yet Harry could not tear his thoughts away from the ultimate betrayal. William's fingerprints were etched into every clause. The path to this moment had been paved by months of insidious calculation. Charles had fiercely resisted his elder son's hardline demands longer than anyone knew. Confidential palace records revealed that the king had personally shot down 2 earlier proposals, including a plan that would have merely suspended Harry's title temporarily. The king had wept behind closed doors, terrified that even a temporary measure would make him appear cruel to his own flesh and blood. But Prince William was never interested in emotional concessions or temporary punishments. With cold, relentless precision, the heir assembled an unassailable constitutional case, demonstrating to their father how a rogue prince, operating beyond the reach of palace protocol, could use his birthright as a weapon against the throne once William himself inherited the crown. To William, hesitation was not mercy, it was fatal weakness. Every historic rupture has its exact point of no return, an instant where the invisible threads binding a family snap forever. For the House of Windsor, that moment arrived during an unannounced, ultra-secret family dinner held in the shadowed halls of Windsor Castle. Charles had orchestrated the gathering as a desperate, unofficial attempt to construct a fragile peace, a night without cameras, without secretaries, and without official records. The king believed that the ancient walls could offer sanctuary to set boundaries before the impending public storm. Harry arrived expecting a compassionate dialogue about his family's security, palace access, and his ability to see his father. William, however, crossed the threshold with a chilling purpose. He demanded a legally binding, absolute guarantee of confidentiality, ensuring that private royal letters, family discussions, and personal exchanges could never again be weaponized in explosive interviews or memoirs. The atmosphere in the dining room curdled instantly. Harry lashed out, accusing the palace apparatus of systematically stripping away his dignity until nothing remained, then framing his exile as a personal choice. Charles lowered his head, listening to his son accuse him of calculated erasure. The silence hung like ice until William shattered it, stating that the immense privileges of a prince could never exist without submission to duty. Then, the night descended into chaos. Harry violently pushed his chair back from the table, the sharp scrape echoing off the oak walls, and delivered a terrifying ultimatum. If the palace did not rectify its narratives, he would unleash the private correspondence of the royal family to the world. Charles gasped in disbelief. William did not shout. He simply stared across the room at his brother with a terrifying certainty. The brother he loved was gone. In his place stood an adversary wielding family secrets against the crown. The psychological war migrated to the king's private study at Clarence House. There, isolated from the world, the 2 brothers were forced into one final, brutally intimate showdown without advisors or protocol. William laid the confidential constitutional briefing on the table between them like a loaded weapon. He informed Harry in flat, unyielding tones that every public use of the princely title created dangerous confusion between personal celebrity and sovereign authority. A prince's rank was not a private commodity. It gave weight to every attack against the monarchy. Harry's eyes burned with furious indignation as he accused William of weaponizing the crown to crush anyone who defied his authority. Years of buried resentment erupted into the room. William stood, pushed his chair aside, and delivered the ultimate verdict. Protecting the institution was not an act of malice, even when the person threatening it was his own brother. In that silent room, the brotherly bond was destroyed, replaced by the cold mechanics of total dynastic warfare. Late into the evening, within the shadowed sanctuary of Clarence House, King Charles sat motionless at his desk, overwhelmed by the weight of constitutional briefings that dictated the survival of the crown. The faint glow of a desk lamp carved deep lines into his face as Queen Camilla entered without a sound, placing a warm hand over his ice-cold fingers. She recognized the profound exhaustion in his posture and posed the single, piercing question that tore at his conscience. Was he issuing this devastating command as a sovereign duty to protect the state, or was he grieving the ultimate surrender of his own child? Charles knew in his soul that a temporary suspension of Harry's title would solve nothing. It would merely leave a ticking time bomb for the next generation. William's final argument had been flawless and lethal in its execution. So long as Harry retained the style of a prince, any future salvo launched from exile would carry the undeniable weight of the royal seal, effectively allowing an estranged prince to challenge the legitimacy of King William once the crown passed. To guarantee the stability of the throne tomorrow, the father was forced to sacrifice his son today. Surrendering to the relentless logic of statecraft, Charles insisted upon one personal condition: a father's final, desperate shield for his exiled child. The public announcement, he commanded, must not frame Harry's removal as a disgrace, a punishment, or a reaction to betrayal. It had to be presented strictly as a constitutional separation, establishing an absolute legal boundary between private existence and sovereign authority. Tucking a handwritten letter beneath the official legal parchment, Charles allowed his trembling pen to trace a fragile plea. Meet me once, not as sovereign and subject, but as father and son. With a quiet, broken exhale that rattled in his chest, the monarch applied his signature. The red wax was stamped, the decree became law, and the identity Harry had known since birth was officially terminated. Just hours before the news was released to a waiting world, the final, harrowing face-to-face confrontation took place behind locked palace doors. Security officers cleared the surrounding hallways, mobile devices were confiscated, and no advisors or courtiers were permitted to observe the reckoning. For the first time in years, Charles and Harry stood alone in the same room, without speechwriters, secretaries, or the heir waiting in the shadows. The decree was signed. The legal machinery was irreversible. What hung in the stifling air between them was not a negotiation, but a catastrophic emotional confrontation. Harry stood rigid near the marble fireplace, his posture defensive, his eyes burning with a volatile mix of deep-seated fury and devastating betrayal. Harry cut through the painful silence with a voice sharp enough to draw blood, refusing to offer protocol or reverence. Did William force your hand? Did you trade your own son to satisfy his ambition? Charles did not turn his head or avert his gaze. He acknowledged openly that the future king had pressed him relentlessly, exposing every security flaw and challenging every moment of parental hesitation. Yet the monarch's voice remained firm despite the strain. William presented the harsh reality of the crown, but the signature on that parchment is mine, the authority is mine, and the unbearable weight of this guilt will remain mine until my final breath. The raw reality of the sentence washed over Harry, shattering his composure. He spoke of the title not as a symbol of aristocratic privilege, but as his last tangible thread to his late mother, Princess Diana, the identity he carried as a grieving boy walking behind her coffin through the silent, weeping streets of London. Stripping away "Prince" felt like an intentional act of erasure, a brutal attempt to wipe out the child he had been before royal duty destroyed his family. Charles reached out a spotted, trembling hand toward his son, but froze as Harry instinctively stepped back into the shadows. The king confessed that he had delayed signing the document for months, terrified that history would judge him as a heartless monarch who destroyed his own blood. But delay, Charles explained, would only pass an uncontainable war onto William's future reign, leaving the institution ruined from within. With his voice dropping to a ragged whisper, Harry admitted that his threat at Windsor to publish confidential family letters had been spat out in blind, wounded rage, a desperate cry to be heard, not a calculated assault. But Charles looked at him with profound sorrow, whispering that when private pain is brandished as a public threat, trust is permanently destroyed. The confrontation ended without a dramatic embrace, without tears of reconciliation, and without forgiveness. Harry picked up his father's handwritten letter, folded it carefully into his coat pocket, and turned toward the heavy doors. As he stepped out into the cold corridor, the ancient clocks of Buckingham Palace began their rhythmic chime, signaling that the private tragedy of a family was about to become the public judgment of the world. As the first pale light of morning broke over London, the tragic secret locked within palace chambers exploded across the global stage in an avalanche of breaking reports. News networks abruptly halted regular programming, their anchors speaking with grave intensity as front pages across the globe flashed the shocking revelation. Prince Harry's royal identity had been formally revoked. Outside the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, hundreds of journalists gathered against the heavy, damp fog. The palace had released a tightly controlled legal statement confirming His Majesty's binding decision, framing the event not as an act of parental punishment, but as an absolute constitutional separation, a definitive severance, removing royal authority from an individual who no longer represented the crown. Behind locked doors, royal courtiers moved with chilling efficiency, updating official state registries, altering future ceremonial orders, and issuing strict protocol directives that the king's younger son was never again to be addressed by his princely title. Line by line, the identity Harry had carried since birth was scrubbed from official history, turning the secret decree into an unyielding public reality. In the quiet solitude of his study, Prince William watched the televised media frenzy alone, his face carved in dark shadow, showing no hint of triumph. Catherine stepped into the room without a sound, standing beside him as commentators on the screen openly identified him as the decisive force behind his brother's downfall. William admitted in a low, heavy voice that while he had successfully protected the throne from future turmoil, the victory had permanently extinguished whatever fragile trust remained between the brothers. She reminded him gently that preserving an ancient institution required painful sacrifices, but the future king simply stared at the floor, whispering that victory felt bitterly hollow when the adversary defeated was the brother who had shared his childhood. He had secured the future of the crown, but the cost was an eternal estrangement. Thousands of miles away, Harry sat in absolute silence, watching archival television footage of his younger self walking behind his mother's coffin, juxtaposed against brutal headlines announcing his official banishment. The contrast between the beloved prince the world had cheered for and the exiled brother stripped of his birthright was unbearable. With a slow motion, he turned off the screen, plunging the room into darkness. Beside him, Meghan remained quiet, understanding that any explosive public reaction would only serve William's narrative, that Harry was driven by volatile anger rather than principle. His silence became his final act of defiance, a refusal to give the palace the spectacle it expected. Outside Buckingham Palace, public tension reached a fever pitch as crowds argued fiercely beneath the royal balcony. Street vendors held up special newspaper editions bearing the headline, "The Brother Who Won." Staunch monarchists praised William for defending the state, while vocal critics condemned him as a ruthless strategist who had used political power to erase his own brother. The nation severed down the middle, transforming a deeply private family tragedy into an ideological war over the modern soul of the monarchy. The true reality of Harry's fall was revealed weeks later during the first state ceremony held under the new constitutional order. As the royal procession entered the cathedral, the official order of precedence, the ranked list governing the placement of the royal family, featured a haunting void. Where a prince had stood for decades, there was now only an empty space. King Charles paused beside his seat, his eyes locking onto the blank gap in the ceremonial program where his son's name had once been printed. His fingers rested against the crisp paper for a long moment, but he issued no command to restore what had been removed. Statecraft had conquered emotion. The monarch had preserved the continuity of the crown, yet the triumph offered no solace to the father who still remembered two young brothers standing together before suspicion drove them apart. William assumed his position beside the king without a smile, knowing he had built an impenetrable shield around his future reign, yet fully aware that Harry would forever view him as the architect of his destruction. From exile, Harry issued a brief, dignified statement, accepting the legal reality while declaring that no document could ever strip away his military service, his personal history, or his eternal bond with Princess Diana. Charles kept a copy of that statement in his private desk drawer, placed side by side with the unanswered personal letter he had written to his son, twin reminders of an irrecoverable loss. The war for power was over. The monarchy moved forward with its authority absolute, but its heart permanently broken. A final dynastic victory, purchased through the silent heartbreak of a father and his sons. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more untold historical deep dives.